You guys can hear me all right though, right? Like
yes.
I'm not dying too much?
No, I think
Yep,
you're all
okay.
good.
Okay, sweet. So you guys would have met Michael Lung this morning, and he would have started you guys off on physiology for the nerves, and he would have started off with the resting membrane potential. So if we go to the next one. Yeah, so our membrane potential is essentially it's the constant difference in charge between the inside of our nerves and the outside of our nerves. And the main thing to take from here is that the inside the nerve is negative 70 millivolts compared to the outside. So that means the inside is overall more negative compared to the outside. And this is due to a few things, and it's primarily due to a few ions. So our potassium ions, our chlorine ions, our sodium ions, and our organic anions. And we'll be going through all of these soon. But essentially all of these ions will be moving around. Some of them will be a bit more permeable than others. Some of them will be attracted to each other as well, or pushed away from each other, and that'll result in our resting membrane potential. So if we go to the next slide. So we'll start off with just looking at a bunch of our channel types. So these are pathways through the membrane that allow our charged particles to move through since they can't diffuse through. So we have mechanically gated, voltage gated, ligand gated, and leaky channels. So to begin with, we have mechanical gated channels, and these will open and close depending on any physical changes that occur in the environment. We also have voltage gated channels, and these would open and close depending on what the voltage is at that particular location. So some of these might open up when it becomes more positive, and this is what we'll see during our propagating action potentials later down the track. We also have ligand gated channels, and this is where a ligand, or like something like a neurotransmitter or a chemical signal, it'll bind onto the receptor, and this will cause the channel to open up. And then we have leaky channels. Leaky channels are, as the name suggests, they're leaky, so they'll open and close every so often, and this will allow a small amount of ions to pass through at a certain time. The main ones that we'll be focusing on, the main important ones, are voltage gated and leaky channels, I believe, for the rest of nerve physiology. So if we go on to the next one. Okay, so we have some balances to think about. So the main thing to take is that potassium, you tend to find more of it inside the cell, and then sodium, we tend to find more outside the cell. Wait, sorry, I think I said that wrong. Potassium you find inside the cell, sodium you find outside the cell. So you can think of it as cells are kind of in the sea. So the sea is pretty salty, and that would be a sodium around the cell. And although they have different concentrations, they don't balance out because of what we call an equilibrium potential. So if we go to the next one. Yeah, so our equilibrium potential is talking about the different movements or where our ions want to move throughout the cell. So since there's more potassium inside the cell, if we think about our general diffusion rules, it will want to go down the concentration gradient and exit the cell. However, this doesn't fully occur because inside our cell, we also have organic anions. And since cations and anions are attracted to each other, the organic ions will hold some of the potassium back and prevent it from leaving the cell. And then if we consider sodium, sodium is at a high concentration outside the cell. So it wants to flow down the concentration gradient and enter the cell, right? But similarly, chlorine anions, which are outside the cell, will hold back some of the sodium and prevent it from equalizing between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. So therefore, if we consider it overall, neither sodium or potassium are going to be balanced in terms of their concentration inside or outside the cell. They'll be slightly off. Yeah. Good, so this is kind of what we can see here for potassium at least. So potassium, it's at a higher concentration in the ICF, or in the intracellular fluid, and it wants to travel outside. However, the negative protein anions, or the giant red A, will hold back some of those potassium ions, and that results in your equilibrium potential. So next one. Yep. Good. So next, so since we have some leaky channels, and if we remember that our leaky channels have an intrinsic rate of opening and closing, there will be some movement of potassium going out and sodium coming back in, according to their concentration gradients. However, it's really important that we have these sodium-potassium pumps, which are a form of active transport, to counteract some of this movement. So, as our potassium moves out and our sodium moves in, our 3Na2K ATPase pump will try to counteract some of this. So it's essentially going to be swapping 2 potassiums for 3 sodiums. And ATP will be required for this because we're going against the natural order of things. Next slide. And now Jiting, I think, will talk to you about propagating the action potential.
Yes, 1 second as I...
Does anyone have any
share
questions
screen.
about that before my internet dies?
Okay, present. Okay, so now that we know the resting membrane potential and the concentration of ions inside and out of our cells, we can now move on to talking about how we actually get our action potential. Okay, so we have to first understand a few terms and what they mean in regards to the membrane potential. So polarization. So the membrane, you have to know, is normally polarized because there is a difference of charges across the membrane. Now this can be negative or it can be positive. When we depolarize our membrane, this means we're making it less negative. So in other words, we're more positive than at our normal resting membrane potential. So for example, we could go from -70 to -60, even though we're still in the negative zone. We've become more positive. So this is still depolarization. Of course, we could depolarize a lot and we could hit +20. That's also depolarization, just to different extents. Repolarization is when the membrane returns back to resting membrane potential after we've had a wave of depolarization. And hyperpolarization is when the membrane becomes more polarized or more negative than our usual resting membrane potential. For example, we go from a -70 to a -80. And so here we illustrate what these terms mean on a diagram. So normally our membrane is polarized and our resting membrane potential is -70. When our action happens, we get first a wave of depolarization, more positive, come back down to our original resting membrane potential. This is called repolarization. And then we can also get hyperpolarization, which is we kind of get too much repolarization to the point where we go below our original resting membrane potential. So we're now more negative than our RMP. And of course, our cells always like to go back to its normal resting potential, so it will recover from our hyperpolarization. Okay. So Peter's already given an introduction to the important channels involved. So the main, one of the more important types is voltage-gated channels. And for that, we have 2 main important voltage-gated channels. So one is our sodium-gated and one is our potassium-gated. So if we look at our sodium-gated, this one is the more complicated one, I would say, because it has 3 states: open, closed, and inactivated. Now, it's important to know that for our sodium voltage-gated channels, they cycle through these 3 states quite rapidly. And when it opens, it will allow sodium to enter the cell. When it's inactivated, it'll remain blocked. And regardless of any further stimulation, you're not going to reopen the channel, and this essentially prevents any more sodium ions from entering. This will be important in what's called the refractory period, which we'll talk about later. So moving on to our voltage-gated potassium channels. This one is a little bit simpler because it's only got two states. So it's either open or it's closed. When it's open, this allows potassium to exit the cell. So don't get the exit and enter wrong. For voltage-gated potassium, when it's open, it allows potassium to exit the cell. Now, the main difference between these two is that, I think someone's got their, I think someone needs to mute themselves. So these channels open and close very slowly. So remember, sodium is fast, potassium is slow. Yep. Okay. So now we actually talk about the steps or what's involved in actually initiating an action potential. So the first step is you've got a neuron, it's at resting membrane potential, and both ion channels are closed. Okay, so if I just annotate on this diagram here, we start off essentially and both of them are in a closed state. On to step 2. So the membrane is essentially brought to the threshold voltage by depolarizing stimulus, which initiates the signaling for ion channels to open. So we get that signal, it's going to depolarize, we've hit the threshold, which is an all or nothing threshold, and our ion channels are ready to open. Now, if we remember our sodium, this was fast, and our potassium, this guy's slow. So which one's going to open first? Well, our fast guy, our sodium channel, is going to open first, as you see here. So on to step 3, our sodium channels open rapidly, and because it's now open, we get the entry of sodium ions, and this is essentially what causes this huge depolarization of the membrane, because sodium ions are positive. So once we hit the peak, okay, so at maximum possible depolarization, the sodium ions have now rapidly become, the sodium channel has become inactivated. Okay, so here it is, it's inactivated. And finally, our slow guy, our potassium channel, is open, because remember, it's slow. So now what's happened, because it's inactivated, one, we're no longer getting any more sodium into our cell. And because our potassium channels are open, this allows potassium ions to leave the cell. And this will repolarize our membrane, okay, because positive potassium ions are leaving the cell. Now on to step 6. So the potassium channels are also very slow to close. Yep. So that's the reason why we can become hyperpolarized. If you see here, our potassium channels, they're still open because they open slowly and they close slowly. So as they're slowly closing, more and more potassium is leaking out. So we might become hyperpolarized. So we're going to be more negative than our resting membrane potential here. Now, on top of that, there's also extra potassium leaving the cell due to voltage-gated channels on top of our normal potassium leaky channel. So we've now essentially got 2 different channels that are facilitating the exit of potassium ions. And finally, we return back to our resting membrane potential, step 7, because finally the slow guy, the potassium channels, have now caught up and are now closed. Our sodium ions have reverted from being inactivated to being fully closed. They're reset and they're ready for another action potential. And so this diagram down here shows the relative membrane permeability. So if you see the membrane permeability for sodium ions, so the amount of sodium moving between the membrane, pretty much is the same as our action potential because of the ability for our sodium voltage-gated channels to open quickly and close quickly. Whereas if you look at the red line, which is for our potassium, it's got a bit of a lag compared to our sodium. And that's because our potassium voltage-gated channels open and close slowly. So I guess one of the high yield things here is just to know the different states of the channels in relation to this, where's the text? In relation to this diagram here. Now, moving on to what's called the refractory period, which we did touch on previously. So there's two types. We've got an absolute and a relative. So first, going through absolute. So this is when all of our sodium channels are either open, so they've already been stimulated, or they are now inactive. So they can no longer be stimulated any further. And so therefore, no matter how much more you stimulate, no more sodium's going to enter the cell. And the reason for this is because during this time, no second action potential is possible during the absolute refractory period, because no more sodium channels are able to open to allow that depolarization to happen. And the inactive state of our sodium channels must be removed by repolarizing the membrane. Now, our relative is slightly different. So this is when most sodium channels are already back to their closed state. So when they're closed, they can now be re-stimulated to open and allow entry of sodium ions. The problem here is that during this time, although it's possible to essentially elicit another response or another potential,